The marketing term cum mega genre that is young adult is a contentious issue amongst readers, and for good reason. There are huge swathes of the community that read exclusively YA, and there is equally massive numbers of people who will avoid any book that's labelled YA, even if the label is attached retroactively to its original publication. Given that, any opinion on YA is likely to be a controversial one, and based on the title, I'm sure you can tell that my position is largely negative, though not entirely. First things first, we need to define what is meant by YA, because the term has many contradictory meanings, and that will not serve us well. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you can see the beginnings of YA happening, though it's not really anything special yet. A few librarians attempting to help the people using their libraries try to take some of the more popular and older-leaning children's books, as well as some of the more accessible adult books, particularly with coming-of-age themes that tended to appeal to younger readers, and put them together. These books were put on the same shelves in order to encourage young teens to read them. As the 40s and 50s saw a rise of the teenager as a recognised social group, more and more media was actively aimed at them. Margaret Soggin is often credited as the person who coined the term young adult when she put out her Books for Young Adults column in 1944 in order to promote books to the teenage demographic. For the first few decades, the vast majority of books being put out as YA were vapid romance with extremely predictable plots, and contemporary slice-of-life books, nothing that anyone really gave any time to. A few notable books came out, including Lord of the Flies by William Golding, The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, and the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. One or two standouts per decade would reach the notice of the general public, such as A Wrinkle in Time, Redwall, the Earthsea books, but honestly, YA was little more than an afterthought until the start of the 90s, at which point serialised books became the big money spinner. The likes of The Babysitter's Club by Anne N. Martin, the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine, and the Animorphs series by K.A. Applegate sold millions, while others like the Forgotten Realms series by R.A. Salvatore and the Star Wars Thrawn series by Timothy Zahn were able to tap into established audiences from already established franchises, even though they weren't really as young as the previous examples. Still, despite this clear commercial viability, they were never really given any respect and largely ignored outside of their respective markets. Notice that most of the books that we've been discussing would now be called middle grade. This is something we'll address later, but it is worth noting that what I'm talking about here is not what people mean when they say YA now. The big shift in YA comes from a book that is not even considered YA itself. We all know what that book is. Harry Potter came out of nowhere and completely redefined literature. It became the biggest selling series ever and managed to create a fandom that to this day is one of the biggest and most influential in all of literature. The series managed to take age-old tales, not that dissimilar from the likes of the Chronicles of Narnia before it, and modernise it in such a way that it appealed on a truly gargantuan scale. Then, through the simple themes of coming of age, friendship, escapism, and fighting Wizard Hitler, as well as the ingenious idea of having the complexity of the books advance with the readers, the series was able to go from what we would call a middle grade book in the first 2, maybe 3 books, to the personification of YA, with the latter books as the characters aged up and the stories expanded to explore more mature themes, with the characters now in their late teens. Copycats came out from behind every rock, and the early 2000s saw the likes of the Percy Jackson series and the Lemony Snicket series take off, though there were plenty of attempts that failed to find an audience as well. Other series like The Inheritance Cycle, Alex Rider, and The Ranger's Apprentice all tried to capitalise on the hero going on an adventure formula, and while predictable, they're not that bad. These books were aimed at teens, and they did that job well. The apparent age range of 12 to 17 was what was intended, and they did a decent job offering some escapist fantasy, and while the protagonists within these books were overwhelmingly teen boys, the books themselves tended to be quite gender neutral, as both boys and girls latched onto them and found themselves loving them. This would not remain the case. As the Harry Potter craze started to die down following the release of the last book, there needed to be something to replace it. That something skewed the YA trend in a way that it has never recovered from, and it made the entire marketing push that is YA gender-specific and extremely toxic. This book is a book that many people hate on, and that some have begun to defend as overhated, and as an individual book in a vacuum that might even be the case. But considering its influence on this industry, it most assuredly isn't. Twilight by Stephenie Meyer is the beginning of the downfall of what we call YA, and my god, this fall was meteoric. Released in 2005, it was moderately successful, but it wasn't until the film released in 2008 that the feedback loop really took hold, making it into the franchise juggernaut we all know it as today. Effectively, Twilight spawned a whole new genre, the paranormal romance genre, which took over the YA space almost entirely, as for a few years the only YA books that were released were paranormal romance. These books all followed the exact same template. A blank slate teenage girl, and it was always a teenage girl, would fall in love with a paranormal creature that presents like an idyllic example of the teen boy, but is often twice her age or more. These could be vampires, demons, werewolves, fallen angels, fae, or even aliens. These relationships would be worryingly toxic to the point of being outright abusive, and while there was usually some supernatural or paranormal event happening in the background, it was generally sidelined, often being resolved off camera, so to speak, so the teen romance angst could be the focus. This new subgenre, unlike the more fantasy adventure YA that came before it, was aimed entirely at young teen girls, and it was a perfect bullseye. The books and franchises that spawned from this are too numerous to count, with the likes of Hush Hush, Fallen, City of Bones, Beastly, Evermore, Beautiful Creatures, Shiver, Vampire Academy, Angel's Blood, Kiss at Midnight, and so many more. I could legitimately keep going for hours. These are just examples that released between 2005 and 2009, by the way, and some of them border on outright erotica at times. What Twilight created was an infection. Now, the question is raised in my head when considering this trend. Was Twilight and the franchises that copied it creating this disturbed psychological trend in young girls, or were they always vapid, romance-obsessed, personality-devoid morons who fantasized about being in abusive relationships with idyllic-looking older men masquerading as boys who'd manipulate them into becoming angsty emotional wrecks unable to function without defining themselves by which of the men they'd most like to fuck? Was this the normal psyche of the 13-year-old girl? Because if it is, that's a bit disturbing. Remember, the primary audience for this shit was teen girls. But it wasn't just teen girls. Pre-teen girls were also encouraged to read this, because the YA label was pushed as a children's bridging label. So girls as young as 11 and 12 were being presented with this as if it was a positive thing. We're talking about a franchise in which the bland as dishwater reader insert plain girl attempts suicide multiple times just to get the attention of the brooding man boy who's literally grooming her. In another of the franchises I mentioned above, City of Bones, the first in the Shadowhunter series, there is an actively physical and emotionally abusive incestuous relationship presented as a central romance, and that's one of the more successful franchises in this trend. And to think we wonder why relationships and gender dynamics are suffering right now. This stuff was and is still vile and is the standard for the genre. Now, don't mistaken me here. Media aimed at boys was and is equally as vapid. You only need to see how terrible the action films of the day became, with the likes of the Transformers films as the obvious example. Films made primarily to appeal to the underdeveloped psyche of teen boys who want nothing but explosions and hardcore action elements in their media. Teen boys are fucking idiots who sit there laughing to themselves about nothing, like some recreation of Beavis and Butthead as a defense mechanism for being too immature and too fucking stupid to process the world around them. If I was a teen girl, I wouldn't be interested in dating the average teen boy either. They have the intelligence of a squashed apricot and are about as capable of empathy and compassion as a stuffed iguana. The big difference is, while this immature machismo crap is just as vapid and stupid as the tween romance obsession, it at least doesn't last. Young men are actively shamed for liking this crap, and acting like immature idiots once you reach even your late teens will quickly turn you into a social leper. It's expected that you grow out of this stuff, and if you go back to enjoy it later, it's in the name of irony and nostalgia only. Men are forced to grow up because their stupid teen phase is so obviously moronic that it becomes deeply embarrassing to engage with even as early as your late teens. This is not how it works for media aimed at girls. Not only was this paranormal romance trend pushed as the new YA for girls as young as 11 and 12, it was embraced by older girls too. Not just older teen girls. Girls in their 20s would read it unironically and claim to like it. And I call them girls, not women, because they were little girls in the body of 20-year-olds. They would assign themselves to Team Edward and Team Jacob. They would decide to name boys from these books as their book boyfriend, a trend they still do even now on YouTube. Something that, when boys do it about anime girls, comes across as so cringeworthy that they are laughed at and mocked by most of society. But girls will regularly defend and latch onto a fictional male character as their boyfriend in a bizarre case of delusion. There was even a substantial number of older women who read this unapologetically, to the point where the Twi-Mums fandom of mothers of teenagers who also loved Twilight would fangirl over it together with their daughters. The fact that adult women didn't see how disgustingly abusive these relationships were is very distressing. What we can take from this is Twilight was much worse of an influence than we ever give it credit, and the effect it had on literature and on the mentality of young girls is far-reaching and disgusting. Thankfully, the vapid nature of these books did cause a backlash, which grew over time, with Twilight becoming a trendy thing to hate on for a while, though that hate was really just a counterculture backlash, and it was largely a male reaction, nowhere near as large as people remember it. It was time for the next step along the YA line, though. After all, you need to get the male audience on board as well if you want to really be successful. The paranormal romance was squeezed dry, and eventually it was replaced. One book from 2008 that would get a film adaptation in 2012 would see this new form and new trend gather. The Hunger Games marked the beginning of the YA dystopia trend. YA dystopia was the next evolution from the paranormal romance, with books like The Hunger Games, Divergent, The Fifth Wave, The Maze Runner, Legend, and The Darkest Mind, to name but a few, all coming between 2008 and 2013, and all spawning a multi-book franchise and film deals. These books were far more well-rounded than their previous trend, with more focus on action and plot, which allowed them to appeal to boys as well as girls, while still having a strong romance subplot present. They were still fundamentally romance novels at their core, as at this point all YA books were pretty much mandated to be romance novels first and foremost, whatever genre they were attempting to be second. Dystopia was just the fashionable backdrop for these stories, and it was very clear that the world building took a backseat to the romance, as on deep inspection few of these worlds hold up to any real scrutiny. At the very least, The Hunger Games was actually well written, unlike Twilight, which allowed these franchises to become mainstays for many. I personally own both the Hunger Games and Divergent trilogies and consider them competent and entertaining books with solid themes, characterizations, and engaging plot. The issue here is the subtext, which I will come to in a moment. It's very clear and easy to see the trend that was coming up in these stories. The teenage female protagonist, and it was always a female teenage protagonist, was now the same bland average girl that was in the paranormal romance, so the reader self-insert would still apply. Only now she was going to learn to be a strong, independent woman. She was going to learn all about who she was inside, and she was going to become a leader, obviously, because we all know the best qualified leaders are teenage girls. This dystopian world, which will always be a post-apocalyptic USA with flimsy and not especially deeply thought-out caste systems, based on very broad characteristics because that's the new gritty version of the house system from Harry Potter, will give people a way to identify with the franchise by giving them a faction to align with. Naturally, the protagonist will be in the faction for brave people because we all have to copy Gryffindor, or there'll be a super special person who defies the category system altogether. The new dystopian world will have a fascist government, naturally, though it won't be given any real depth, and our teen girl protagonist will be poised to lead a rebellion of plucky teenagers against the corrupt fascist status quo adults through the power of realising her potential. This will all happen while the idyllic male lead, who will be a prominent part of her resistance or a member of the opposition who changes sides because he instantly fell in love with her, is persuaded in an angsty romance plot, which will be about half of the book, to fall for her. It's a very formulaic pattern. In these dystopian stories, the romance is generally nowhere near as toxic as it was in paranormal romance. It's still manipulative, but it's not that manipulative. Though it may be unorthodox and unrealistic, it's at least just a fantasy of a romance rather than a toxic romance. And at least it's generally not actively encouraging and promoting abuse. The angst is usually earned because the world is a dystopian world, and usually there's something important that actually would lead to unreasonable levels of anxiety for the protagonist. Finally, there's enough action and intrigue in the story that it doesn't just feel like a schlocky romance. This is why these books so often got turned into films. This move in the trend in YA was very much a positive move, and YA went from being almost unreadable and offensive paranormal romance books that if I was a parent I would actively discourage my daughter from reading, to formulaic and somewhat trite fiction with equal measures of action and intrigue alongside wish fulfillment and romance. I have no issue with this. In fact, I actively like this trend and wish it had continued. Sadly, it died out by 2015, and while there are still YA dystopias being produced, they have nothing close to the market penetration they had 7 years ago. Instead, what's replaced them is a weird Frankenstein of the paranormal romance and the dystopian YA. A mix where the fantasy elements have come back and the teen girl protagonist spends most of the story seeking out a paranormal boy, usually a fae, they, for some reason, have become the big trend recently. And they still maintain this rebellion subplot, but it's far more sidelined. The concerning part about these YA dystopian novels, though, was, as I said earlier, the subtext. We've taken a generation of young girls who've been raised to be obsessed with romance, to want abusive relationships, but with unrealistic and warped ideas of what men are and should be. And now these girls who've spent years being told they are instantly desirable to all men, even though they're pointedly plain and bland, are now given whole new aspects to add to their personality. These dystopian novels all present the protagonist as an anti-government anarchist figure, someone who starts out as nothing special, but realizes her potential and becomes a strong female character. They become a resistance leader against the faceless fascist element, which is always whatever's in charge, is generally presented as intrinsically male, and is usually presented as a government figure. Do you see where this is going? Because if you don't, you're about to get whiplash as this video becomes extremely political. This trend is basically Antifa recruitment propaganda. Not necessarily intentionally so, but propaganda all the same. We have a social trend where teen girls are being actively encouraged to rebel and fight against any and all authority figures, and franchises where literally any authority is labelled as fascism, often to a cartoonish degree. These rebel systems are often extremely communist-friendly in the way they're portrayed, with hints that the fascist controlling force is also a representation of capitalism. So the rebellion can usually represent a noticeable wealth disparity, as well as a gender dynamic and a teens versus adults dynamic. I put it to you that this move by YA salted the mine, so to speak, with the younger generation, making them more receptive to the same kind of sentiment, language and rhetoric that is now coming from the extremist politics of the left wing. A decade of extremely feminine-focused fantasies, first pseudo-pornographic sexual empowerment, then actualization and anti-authoritarian social empowerment, to claim that the YA publishing scene wasn't pushing feminist power fantasies would just be ridiculous. And with the morphing of third-wave feminism into the new identity politics, gender politics and social justice movements of the last decade, it's easy to see how these books laid the groundwork for a cultural shift in young girls, as well as the boys who returned to YA once the dystopia trend allowed for more gender-neutral baselines. Remember as well, at this time, boys have been beaten down. Regular campaigns to highlight and condemn masculinity as toxic have become the norm. So now, a cowering and frankly abused male generation is being reintroduced to highly feminist in tone literature amongst their female peers who have now spent a decade being told that they are special and important by default and that all men should love them. And you end up with a generation of boys who are actively encouraged and expected to behave like sad little simps. A generation of boys that see all men in the media targeted at their age range as subservient towards women, men who idolise these women as above them and better than them, and the girls who make up their peers have been indoctrinated since their pre-teens to expect this subservient devotion from men as well, even if they've done sod all to earn it, even from powerful and important men who should be way above them on the social hierarchy. Boys that don't sim for them and don't take on the cowering male feminist ally role are labelled as bigots and villains in the minds of these young girls and subsequently ostracised. Okay, I'm sure at this point I've lost a few people. They're probably listening to this and thinking, well, this guy's a nutter who's projecting political conspiracy theories onto books because he just doesn't like them. But you'd be completely wrong. I actually do like a lot of these books. I think the Harry Potter series is pretty good. Others from that era, such as the Percy Jackson series, are pretty decent too. And while I think the paranormal romance subgenre is fundamentally rotten to its core, the dystopian YA trend is one that I actually enjoy. The likes of the Hunger Games and Divergent series are both series I rate highly, despite the intrinsic flaws I see in their storytelling elements. I'm not claiming that this is some great conspiracy, or that these books shouldn't be enjoyed in isolation. Nor am I saying that authors like Suzanne Collins or Veronica Roth went out of their way to create feminist Antifa propaganda in order to push an agenda. I think they wrote stories that followed established trends that on a macro scale inadvertently did those things. But I'm not assigning malice to them, and I don't think they're bad people. What happened is political extremist groups capitalised on a cultural shift in these books. A cultural shift that these books help to usher in. And that is making the YA genre, frankly, unbearable. What a lot of people don't seem to realise now is just how bipartisan and political the publishing industry has become in the last decade. Entertainment isn't just politically biased now, it's politically mandated. If you attempt to approach a literary agent with a YA novel nowadays, you'll be given a string of social justice requirements. You'll be told how the agents want diversity, and by diversity they mean non-white, non-male, non-straight, non-Western characters in prominent roles. A straight white male lead character from America or Europe will actively damage any novel you wish to produce and will make it a lot harder for you to get published. At the very minimum, they need to be female, or some agents won't even look at them, because at least if your character is female, they can be a strong female character. Strong female characters and LGBT representation are also mandated by these literary agents, which is just a call to make your characters overtly feminist and pander to the political push to overrepresent gay people and place them on a pedestal. All of this is just social justice demands, and the industry makes these demands for no apparent reason. They're just making these demands because, and I want to make this as clear as I possibly can, they are a deeply racist, sexist, heterophobic, anti-Western fascist hate movement that panders to minorities and women. Female isn't a minority, but they'll claim it is because it fits their narrative, in order to push identity politics mentalities, because they are cultural Marxists and they want to push this as the only acceptable thought pattern. This has gone even further than you might imagine, as agents and publishers are now, in the last few years, pushing for something they call own voices. This is a disgusting philosophy that perpetuates the idea that people can only speak about things that the group that they are a member of can historically claim they went through, whether they went through it or not. So if you're a poor white man who lives in a ghetto, you cannot write a story about the ghetto, because that's black people stuff, and you have white privilege. Shut up, you're not allowed to talk about it. But if you're a black person from a middle-class suburb for whom the closest you've ever been to a ghetto is watching the last few minutes of an episode of The Wire, you can write a story about the ghetto, about racist police, about institutionalized racism that you've never actually experienced, because hashtag own voices, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag defund the police, am I right? Fuck the publishing industry. Why don't you eat a whole bucket of fuck you? This move reduces people down to identity labels and nothing else. It takes away all the individuality of people in general. If you don't have the correct label, you are ostracized and you are attacked. The limits to how far this will go are pretty much endless. White men are in effect forced out of YA entirely at this point. If you're a straight white man, you cannot win. You write a book with a black person in it, you'll be attacked for racial appropriation, regardless of how you present them. it will pretty much always be deemed misrepresentation. If you write a book where the characters are all white, you'll be accused of being a racist and a white supremacist. There is literally no path you can follow. Only those few men who throw themselves at the feet of this social justice movement and grovel endlessly are allowed to remain, so long as they openly spew hate at others publicly in order to show how much of an ally they are. Yes, I'm looking at you, Neil Gaiman. You should be fucking ashamed of yourself. You may not believe that this is happening, but if you're defensively typing a message now where you complain and call me a bigot, grow up and get a fucking clue. This isn't some conspiracy, it's provably happening. You only need to look at the Twitter mobs that caused Amelie Wenjot to pull her novel Blood because extremist SJWs decide to take one review and turn it into fuel for a hate mob. You only need to look at the hatred and bile J.K. Rowling received for not following this narrative and for making innocuous comments on Twitter. And yes, they were fucking innocuous. Get over yourselves. Actually read them if you don't know what she said. This trend isn't specific to publishing. Far from it. The political zeal and cancel culture nonsense is so extreme that most recently the cast of the Marvel Cinematic Universe did a rally promotion for Joe Biden in the upcoming US election, and when Chris Pratt decided not to take part, not because he doesn't support Biden, but just because he prefers not to speak publicly about politics, he was harassed, threatened and attacked relentlessly, labelled as a bigot and a white supremacist. These labels are the favourites of the extreme left, and campaigns to have him cancelled and removed from future projects were started. Petitions were circulated, hate piece articles were written, targeted harassment campaigns were pushed. And I'm not talking the fake kind of harassment campaigns that people claimed Gamergate did but never actually showed any evidence happened. I mean real harassment campaigns. So big that others in Hollywood and other members of the cast of the MCU jumped to his defense and constantly condemned it because they saw just how much hate he was getting, and then they received the same hate in return. The social justice movement at this point is fucking insane, and it controls the entertainment industry. So what we've got, thanks to YA at this point, is an entire generation slowly brainwashed by feminist propaganda and anti-establishment anarchist power fantasies, pushed by a politically correct entertainment industry into thinking that a book being written by a black lesbian is somehow intrinsically more valuable than a book published by a straight white man. This is a societal movement that encourages groupthink and cultural Marxism. This has brewed for years, and now these women are getting older. These girls who read Twilight at 13 and read the dystopian propaganda mill in their late teens. They're in their 20s now, their late 20s now, and they're bringing their tantrums, their prejudice and their brainwashing with them into the adult world. Unable to devoid themselves from the fiction they read, infantilized and brainwashed to the point of active retardation, these girls lash out. They're the protagonist after all, and the authority is doing something they don't approve of. It must be fascist. It's always fascist. Doesn't matter if they don't actually know what fascist means. The orange man on the news must be fascist because he's the opposition, and as such, she must lead the rebellion to take him down, even if that rebellion is really nothing more than a hate mob on Twitter. The current generation of women have literally spent the last 2 decades of their fucking lives being taught to think this way, in this toxic, combative, hateful way. This is why YA is such a problem. Should I have hit out at other equally valid truths about the mega genre? Like how the prose is so disgustingly simple that it looks like it's targeting middle schoolers, while the content has aged up to appeal to women in their mid-20s, because the machine that pushes this propaganda wants to keep these books accessible. They don't want to isolate anyone who can't handle complex prose, so they keep it simple, usually in first-person present, despite the clunkiness and limitations of such narrative convention, and they make sure not to alienate anyone too stupid for adult literature, which is the majority of people reading YA now, if we're honest. Overgrown children in the bodies of adults unable to handle the real world. I could have gone on to discuss the issues with narrative conventions, how these books always contain people outside of the law and outside of normal society. They're thieves, assassins, rebellion leaders, and yet all of these dark characters in these books are never allowed to be evil. None of them ever actually show themselves to be bad people. Everyone is fundamentally a good person who's just a misunderstood rogue standing up against oppression. This is why books like Six of Crows end up feeling contrived, and why books like Scythe are unable to take their concept to the obvious conclusion they should. They're held back by the constraints that YA books can't tackle themes that are deemed inappropriate, and really nothing is inappropriate in YA anymore because of another issue I've barely covered. And that is the great age shift in YA, which means that it's no longer a teen genre. YA has kept the same audience it always had, rather than remaining a term for marketing books to the 12 to 17-year-old crowd. The young girls that were reading Twilight at age 13 are now approaching 30, and the publishers that publish YA are still marketing to them. Still pushing the simplistic prose, coming-of-age stories, unrealistic quasi-romance books to women in their late fucking 20s. Reinforcing this immature high schooler mentality on full-grown adult women. This means that the middle grade age category has now expanded to include any books that are genuinely aimed at teenagers, while the YA category has become the genre for stupid women in their 20s who require prose written for a 14-year-old and themes and content designed to appeal to the socially retarded, infantilized lack of development and brainwashed social expectations that have come along with them. I could keep going about this. I could keep dissecting the elements of this industry, explain in more detail exactly why young adult literature today is this perversion of what it once was. But I think we all get the point now. It's a genre of schlock romance, cash grab copycats, and now extremist propaganda, hamstrung by a severe requirement of the politically charged, hate-filled, culturally Marxist, pseudo-anarchist entertainment industry, too stupid to realise the capitalist Western society they apparently hate is the very thing that made them rich, successful and influential in the fucking first place. But of course they don't understand this, they're mostly thick. To those who've held out this long, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say here. I suspect I'm going to have an angry SJW mob and infantilized adult readers of YA calling for me to be cancelled. But they can't cancel me. I'm not part of their world, and I don't give a fuck what they think. I'm firmly a part of the counterculture to their bullshit, and all their screams do is highlight my points. For everyone else, I hope on some level this was entertaining or interesting to you. I hope I gave you something to think on, and thanks for watching.